So Tom's going to talk about controlling shareholders in the short-termism debate.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very happy that I also had a chance to present a bit of my own research here today. This is based on a recent working paper that's on SSRM. So if you have any comments, feedback, very much appreciated, because this is very much a work in progress. It's also a little bit of a research agenda because with the Jean-Pierre Bloem lecture, we're actually starting a project now. We hired a PhD student, Theo Mollens, who's also in the room, who will be working on the topic of short-termism, fundamental European corporate governance as well. So yeah, this is part of a broader research project. And what I want to do with this paper is to add the role of controlling shareholders to the short-termism debate and to discuss the potential policy implications of that. And to do that, I start with two basic models of short-termism that you could have. And I think other people will discuss to what extent these models are actually true in practice. Mark did a bit of that. I think Zach will do a bit of that as well in his presentation. But just to go back to how could short-termism originate? I think the first model that you could have is, well, investors are the problem. So in this model, institutional investors and asset managers are excessively focused on the short term for whatever reason. Perhaps they want to attract clients with short-term returns. Perhaps they are biased. Perhaps capital markets are inefficient. Perhaps they don't have perfect information to monitor executives. But the assumption is that some of them are short-termist. And also the assumption is that they can transmit that short-termism to directors, to managers. So they do that, for example, through shareholder activism. We will talk about that in the afternoon, or through short-term focused executive compensation, which these shareholders influence. And that translates into short-termist corporate outcomes. So excessive dividends or excessive share buybacks and insufficient long-term investments. That's a bit of theory. And you can see that this model is based on an agency problem between different types of investors, the short-termist institutional investors and the others who are presumably more interested in the long-term success of the company. And if you add controlling shareholders to that model, what happens? Well, I think what controlling shareholders can do is they can actually block the transmission of short-termism. If you have a controlling shareholder, it's very unlikely that even a short-termist activist would be able to change anything with regards to how the company is run, because the controlling shareholder has control, so doesn't have to listen to activists, at least if their control is sufficiently stable. And also, they don't really, the controlling shareholders, they can set the executive compensation that they want. So if they want to align managers with the long-term success of the company, they have the incentives and the voting rights to do so in general. So controlling shareholders, they kind of eliminate this investor short-termism problem. Secondly, you could also have a model of managerial short-termism, where you say, well, it's not about short-termist investors. Investors are perhaps long-term oriented. It's about short-termist managers. Managers are, for some reason, inherently short-termist, and that's, I think, there was already talked about by Mark in response to one of the questions. For example, they want to move to a better company, so they want to deliver good results on their watch, even if this harms the long-term performance of the company, because by then they will be gone anyway. And here the problem is actually a lack of accountability. The institutional investors and other investors are not able to sufficiently monitor managers, and that is why managers are acting short-termist. So this is basically the classic managerial agency problem. And again, if you add controlling shareholders to that model, well, it's traditionally well understood that controlling shareholders are a solution to managerial agency problems because they have the incentives and the voting rights to monitor management to more or less extent. But the managerial agency problem is less of a concern in controlled corporations. So again, very important to study the role of controlling shareholders, especially in continental Europe, where the majority of the corporations are controlled by controlling shareholders. Of course, the question is, will this solve short-termism? And I think that depends on whether you believe controlling shareholders are generally more long-term oriented or more short-term oriented. And there's some reasons some arguments on both sides of this question. I think on the one hand, you could say, well, controlling shareholders have several incentives to act more in the long term because they actually are basically, to some extent, locked into the corporation. They have a large and relatively illiquid block of shares in the corporation. They can decide to sell off some of those shares, but they will remain exposed with the rest of their participation to the long-term success of the company. And if they try to sell their whole block of shares, that's probably going to be to a sophisticated buyer, and it will be hard to do some kind of short-termist manipulations. And that will also raise questions in the due diligence or perhaps after the closing of the deal with claims for breach of reps and warranties, for example. So that's one reason that controlling shareholders are to some extent locked in, giving them a more long-term perspective. Second reason is they enjoy some private benefits of control. For example, a family may enjoy running the company, keeping the company inside the family, transferring it to the next generation. And that is also a type of private benefit. And that basically locks the controlling shareholder in the company, gives them a long-term perspective. The other part of the story, of course, is, well, these private benefits of control may also distort the behavior of the controlling shareholders. If they are able to extract benefits from running the company, they're not available to minority shareholders, their incentives may be misaligned, and in some cases, this may lead to short-termism. For example, controlling shareholders may have immediate liquidity needs. A family shareholder that wants to buy a nice family home or buy a nice yacht to travel on. All very important things for the family that are not necessarily aligned with what's needed for the business if the business needs to keep cash inside the business to fund long-term investments. And controlling shareholders may also have incentives to not do additional share issuances, even though those share issuances are necessary to fund long-term investments, if the controlling shareholder doesn't have the means to participate in those transactions and doesn't want to be diluted and lose control either. So some reasons to believe that controlling shareholders may be excessively focused on the short term as well. And if you look at the empirical evidence, we can see that it is a bit of a mixed bag, with some studies finding evidence of a positive impact of controlling shareholders, others finding a negative impact. More generally, what's a bit the problem with such studies, and I think this also goes towards the points made by Holger in regards to executive compensation, it's really hard to tell if there's actually a causal impact of controlling shareholder on firm performance, or whether perhaps firm performance or expected firm performance also determines to what extent, for example, the founders of a company decide to give up control and sell control in the market. So there's a lot of endogeneity issues here because we don't really know if there's perhaps reverse causality or maybe other factors impacting firm performance as well. That being said, I think if we look at empirical evidence, there's some suggestion that it may depend on the type of controlling shareholder. For example, family ownership seems to be positively associated with firm value, but only if the founder is still the CEO or chairman, so remains involved. Or family ownership is generally negatively associated with R&D investment, but this association becomes positive for certain family firms. For example, if the later generations remain involved, or when the family owns more than 30%, which could be seen as proxies for more long-term orientation. We also see that industrial foundations, so non-profits that are tasked with holding the shares typically for the long term, well, they also seem to be positively associated with proxies for long-term orientation, and they have a neutral and sometimes in some studies even a positive effect on firm performance. So I think it's hard to say both theoretically and empirically what the general effect is, and it may depend also on specific controlling shareholders, what type of controlling shareholders do we have? Of course, this also makes it difficult to draw policy conclusions, but I think we can say about certain stuff that doesn't work if we have a controlling shareholder. So traditionally, I think what you want to do if you believe that in the managerial or investor short-termism model, that's what's outlined on this table. If you believe that managers are not short-termist and institutional investors are short-termist, so the investor short-termism model, you insulate managers from shareholders, or you try to lengthen the horizons of institutional investors. By contrast, if you believe that managers are the problem and institutional investors are not, you want to make managers actually more accountable to shareholders. And if you have both, then maybe, yeah, you want to do a bit of both, depending on who is less short-termist. My point here is, well, actually, if you add controlling shareholders to this, most of these things will not really matter anyway. Let me explain that a bit more in detail. If you have, like one of the policy options that's sometimes discussed is directors' duties and giving the directors a duty to take into account the interests of long-term shareholders, maybe even the interests of other shareholders, other stakeholders. Well, in general, that's unlikely to make a big difference in practice because of the business judgment rule and because of a lot of barriers that we have to shareholder litigation. So it's hard to enforce these duties anyway. But if we have a controlling shareholder, it's even less likely to make a difference because the controlling shareholders can hire and fire managers, and that's likely to dominate any kind of relatively weak fiduciary duty that you would impose on the controlling shareholder or the management. Similarly, a lot of the policy debate is about whether we should encourage or discourage shareholder activism. But if you have a controlling shareholder, shareholder activism is largely irrelevant because it's unlikely to be very effective anyway. Similar story for stewardship. In regards to reporting, a lot of discussion is about banning quarterly reporting, introducing sustainability reporting. But if you have a controlling shareholder, what difference is it going to make? These things try to give shareholders a more long-term orientation, but the controlling shareholders can already have and will typically have more information than typical investors in the company. So the question is whether this reporting will make such a difference. One nuance, perhaps, all of these things may have some soft impact because the controlling shareholder's reputation is impacted if there's a shareholder activist that shows up, if it has to report more in a long-term manner, perhaps. So there may be some little bit of an effect. What could work, I think, and this is actually very much related to what we will discuss right after my presentation, the panel on loyalty voting rights. Well, what could work is you could try to encourage controlling shareholders to create and keep control by allowing them to separate their cash flow rights from their control rights, from their voting rights. That way, you make it easier for a controlling shareholder to emerge and actually to retain control of the company, even if they don't have this financial means to participate in future capital increases or if they want to diversify part of their wealth as well. And you can do that through loyalty voting rights, and you can do that through low-cost share structures, pyramid structures, etc. The problem with this solution, however, is that it also is its own enemy in the sense that we all know that creating a wedge between cash flow rights and control increases the incentives for controlling shareholders to extract private benefits. And I just discussed how these private benefits can actually be a source of corporate short-termism as well. So we also have to think about how we could protect minority shareholders. So just to wrap up, what is the policy conclusion that we can take from this? Well, it really depends. It's a very lawyerly answer, but I think it's the only one I can give. If we believe that controlling shareholders are not short-termist and investors generally are, we can try to encourage the creation of control, and we can try to insulate controlling shareholders perhaps even more from minority shareholders. Vice versa, if you believe that investor short-termism is not really a thing, but controlling shareholders are generally short-termist, you could try to lengthen the horizon of controlling shareholders, but I discussed it's not so easy to do that. More successfully, perhaps you could try to reduce extraction of private benefits by empowering minority shareholders so that they can actually monitor the controlling shareholder better and perhaps reduce this potential source of short-termism. And if both are short-termist, again, you want to do a bit of a combination of both and insulate or empower minority shareholders, depending whether you believe who is the most short-termist. So my conclusion, I think controlling shareholders have been given insufficient attention in the debate on short-termism. I think that this matters because they have a very important impact on whether short-termism could exist. If we believe that controlling shareholders are good, they are long-term oriented, we should allow dual class share structures, loyalty voting rights, but that actually also comes with certain costs. If we believe that they're generally short-termist oriented, well, there's not much that we can do, and the traditional solutions that have been offered will not matter much anyway, although we can try to increase minority protection. And finally, for the empirical studies, I think it's very important that one of the control variables is actually insider ownership. And a lot of the studies that we have currently, they don't do this, also because it's often hard to get good data on insider ownership. And actually also because we don't have good external shocks to ownership yet. So that's perhaps a call for future research. And I think that's it, and I yield to Federico.
Yeah. So thank you very much for a very nice presentation and the interesting paper. I will touch just 3 points. The first one is how your paper further undermines the empirical evidence that we have on corporate short-termism. The second one is about loyalty shares that you mentioned as a possible solution to improve, increase the number of controlling shareholders and make them more long-term oriented. And the last one about activists and other minority shareholders in controlled company. So the first point, you mentioned several empirical studies on the impact of corporate short-termism. However, these studies do not provide strong evidence that corporate short-termism is a real problem and how it really affects the market. Most of these studies are based on the US and UK markets. There is one notable exception, which is the EY report of 2020. However, it has been heavily criticized for some methodological flaws, and there is also conflicting data. For example, Frieden Wang shows that in the last 20 years, long-term investment has remained stable. Lastly, short-term focus incentives are a lesser problem in the EU than the US, because in the EU, a bigger portion of the compensation of executive is based on fixed compensation or long-term compensation. Your paper shows that controlling shareholder is a material variable on the data, so we cannot rely on data on widely held companies. But if almost all the data that we have is based on the UK and US market, and we look at the shareholder structure that we have in Europe, we can see that almost all the European countries have a majority of controlling shareholders. So even if there is a problem of corporate short-termism in the US, we cannot apply the same data to Europe. And I don't think we have any other data to rely upon which is not contradicted. So I don't think we have anything to prove that there is a serious problem of corporate short-termism in the EU, which would allow us to take stronger policy measures to further enforce controlling shareholder, or in any case, challenge short-termism. Moving to loyalty shares that you correctly mentioned as a possible solution to increase the number of controlling shareholders or make them more long-term oriented. I see a spectrum of possible policy solution. The less aggressive one would be just to make possible to adopt loyalty shares or other control mechanism before the IPO. The second one, more aggressive, would be to empower also controlling shareholder in already listed company to adopt this solution. This, of course, will upset existing minority shareholders because will reduce the right. An even more aggressive measure would be, for example, the loi Florange of 2014 in France, which pushed the existing listed company to adopt loyalty shares. So they changed the rules of the game, made it easier to adopt loyalty shares. And the even more aggressive solution would be to reduce the right to short-term investors and activists. This can be carried out by just reaching some rights. For example, you have the right to appoint minority directors, but you can also give more power to loyalty shares so they can reach the supermajority required to change the bylaws. So starting from the first point, whether loyalty shares will create new controlling shareholders. I believe that they're very effective in keeping control if they're introduced before the IPO or after the IPO. it makes it easier for the controlling shareholders to remain in control. However, they do not create new controlling shareholder for two main reasons. First, unless you approve aggressive measures like the law of Orange, the existing controlling shareholder, non-controlling shareholder with a big block of stock would not have enough vote to approve loyalty shares. We know that institutional investors are strongly against loyalty shares, so you will not have shareholders passing this kind of resolution. You need to force control the existing company to switch to loyalty shares. Second, even if you force them to switch to loyalty shares, in the EU there is the mandatory tender offer rules. Therefore, if a shareholder has a voting stake below 3% and through loyalty shares it crosses the 3% threshold, you have to launch a mandatory tender offer of the entire share capital. So the only exception is Belgium, which managed to solve this problem. So you can become a controlling shareholder by having a stake below 3% and crossing into loyalty shares without launching a tender offer. However, you still need to have the vote to pass this solution. Second, let's see whether loyalty shares make controlling shareholder more long-term oriented. We see that in a widely held company, minority shareholder would push some CEO and executive to forgo long-term profit investment because they don't see the benefit in the long term. As you mentioned, in case of controlling a control company, you have a controlling shareholder who are focused on the long-term investment because they have much money invested and they're not going to sell it tomorrow. So they will push the company to invest in long-term investment if they see a value in the long term. However, they might not have enough money to raise new capital while keeping control. And loyalty shares will help to solve the solution because the controlling shareholder can raise new capital without losing control because they will use the loyalty votes to keep control while raising new capital. However, the controlling shareholder may just use the loyalty shares to keep control and start selling stock. But if they start selling shares, they might be more focused on whether they're making more money by selling short the stock in the short term. So they will be more focused also on the short-term return of their investment because they're selling stock. They are not anymore blocked with the investment. And we have some evidence. There is this paper of Barbie Bigelli and Croce of 2020 that shows that at least in Italy, when loyalty shares are adopted, control companies do not raise more capital or make a transaction like acquisition, but they rather allow the controlling shareholder to reduce their stake without losing control. Yeah. I can yeah, anyway, they're not particularly difficult. So you mentioned that there are less activist investors in the EU than in the US, which is true. However, in the last few years, activist investors have been increasing. In my slide, there was mentioned data from Lazard, which shows that in EU, activist investors are quite relevant. They represented in the first quarter of 2023, 30% of the activist campaign launched in the first quarter. Of course, a significant portion are activist campaign launched in the UK, but even if you keep out the activist campaign in the UK, there are several important activist campaigns carried out in the EU, and they also target control companies. There is the paper of Toby Castile that you correctly mentioned that are quite effective even in challenging control company. For example, Team was a company very significant in Italy, which was found by Contra to be controlled by Vivendi in 2017. After a few months, Elliott, the famous activist investor, show up, bought 9%, and appointed the majority of the board members. So they can challenge a weakly controlled company, and so they can challenge with control. they can even challenge a situation in which a supermajority is required to pass extra transaction. An example is when you need to raise more capital. Usually in the EU, the approval of capital increase requires a two-thirds majority, which means that activist investors, if they work together with other short-term investors, they can block share capital increases. These supermajority, I think, are not very effective in protecting either the minority shareholder, but they are not all, because of course the controlling shareholder can sometimes have more than two-thirds of the vote and pass a resolution like approving large shares without having the support of other minority investor. And I think that you should consider other policy solutions that will keep the benefit of having active investor. For example, you can have reduce supermajority, so you can have extra transactions that can be in the long term, like raising new money for making long-term investment with 50% of the share capital, but you can have more rules which are focused on self-dealing of control shareholder. For example, if the controlling shareholder is changing the bylaws and there is a disproportionate benefit to the controlling shareholder, in this case, it should require, for example, for the majority or the minority approval. So I think on active investor, you can have some rules that make activists less powerful in pushing short-term measure, but keeping the benefit of having activist investor challenging the control companies. So I need the floor for comments.
I think, thank you first very much. I think this is very useful. I don't disagree with anything. Maybe wanting to reply on the question whether loyalty voting rights allow also controlling shareholders to issue more equity. I think Ludovici will talk a little bit about that. And then in Belgium, for example, we see some examples that they are using it to raise equity. And also with regards to one of the other points, the supermajority for capital increases, for example, we already see that in Belgium. I've done an empirical paper on this, that this is actually typically, even if it requires a supermajority to pass share issuances or to pass an authorization to issue shares to the board, authorization to the board to issue shares, that seems to pass very easily. And authorizations in Belgium are very, very flexible. And especially controlled corporation, I find that there's a very positive impact of the presence of insider ownership. So I'm not so sure that that's a problem. But I do agree that what we should focus on is tackling related party transactions and those type of tunneling by controlling shareholders and empowering minority shareholders, perhaps in that sense, not per se in more generally with regards to other decisions.
Yeah, if I can add, I think that the related party transaction in Europe have a problem because they target only transaction when there's a transfer of money or a consideration. But if you're just changing the rules, like changing the bylaws, you do not need to comply with this rule. Therefore, you can approve loyalty share because technically you are providing them to everyone who want to keep the stock, even though everyone knows that they're in the benefit of the controlling shareholders. So they're not very effective in discriminating changes that are really in the interest of controlling shareholders if there is not an actual transfer of consideration to the controlling shareholder.
Yeah, I fully agree. I've argued in the past for a majority-minority rule for when introducing loyalty voting rights.
Comments, questions? Olga?
Yeah, I have a small individual comment and then two larger points just to provoke you and the other Europeans. The individual point is that you said, well, you can get short-termism because once if you let the controlling shareholder issue these adopt loyalty shares, and then you get some short-termism because of self-dealing and what you do like that, okay? And I thought, well, that's only a problem because the controlling shareholder is not able to sell the block and appropriate the full value of their control when they're selling, because you have the mandatory bid rules. Get rid of the mandatory bid rules, do it the American way, and the problem is solved. The more general version of this is anytime you restrict private contracting, obviously you're going to get inefficiencies. Why don't you just, I mean, you Europeans, go the American way and allow everything in corporate law? Then you get efficient stuff. Then an argument I hear is, well, you get these midstream changes if you allow more loyalty shares now, and then people, they didn't anticipate this. That's short-termism. That's real short-termism at the legislative level, because what you really should be worrying about is creation of new companies. And this focus on the existing ones, I mean, maybe it's partly a symptom of a problem, but really what should be done is to encourage the creation of new companies and make them have good corporate law to do things in the future.
I think with regard to the mandatory bid rule, I think it's a very complicated analysis, but indeed it has important effects of locking in the controlling shareholder to a large extent. But that can also be positive in the sense that that may cause the controlling shareholder to actually be more long-term oriented, although he may want to try to extract private benefits in other ways. And there's also a lot of other considerations not relating to the short-termism debate about the pros and cons of mandatory bid rules. So personally, I would be more like, indeed, allowing corporations to choose whether or not they like the mandatory bid rule, but the Luca Enriquez unbiased stakeholder law. With regards to the more general point, do we maybe need to have less mandatory regulation? Perhaps, yes. I think in general, I would be in favor, but I think for transactions with a clear conflict of interest, I'm a bit worried that will lead to a lot of corporations, especially existing corporations which have a controlling shareholders, opting out of the rules. And perhaps, and that goes a bit to your other question, maybe we need to make different rules for companies that are going to an IPO still, while keeping existing rules in place, or at least providing stronger minority protections for the midstream phase. Because I do agree, for example, encouraging companies to do an IPO and to choose the corporate governance regime that's most flexible for them. That's also in a way effective in combating short-termism, because we need to stimulate the entrepreneurship. I think that's the most long-term thing that you can do.
Isn't there an implicit assumption here that the markets are inefficient, that you have to hold a share for a long time to get the long-term benefits? If the market is efficient, the price will go up today, reflecting the long-term benefits, right? So that's the issue here. If you look at the internet bubble, 2000, no one talked about short-termism. Stock markets rose massively. The companies had no earnings, no cash flow, but huge valuations. And then we were told, oh, the market really cares about the long term. They really are focused on the long-term benefit of the internet revolution. It turned out to be that, and many executives then listened to this and invested in R&D and all this stuff, and they all went bankrupt. So clearly, sometimes, you know, you can't really say, everything depends crucially on to what extent that the market is efficient or not. If the market is efficient, then it doesn't matter how long you own the shares, because the price will reflect the long-term value. No?
Yeah, I fully agree. If the market is efficient, in this paper, I don't want to take a view on that. I just want to say, like, if you believe that the market is inefficient, which is a necessary condition for you to believe that investor short-termism is a thing, then, well, controlling shareholders will solve that anyway, to some extent with some nuances. But I fully agree that's really important, and maybe we should have said it more implicitly. That's an assumption that the market doesn't price long-term cash flows.
But there are additional layers to that. I always talk about that as a three-step rocket. First, you have to believe that the market is inefficient. But secondly, even if there are instances where the market is inefficient, you have to believe that, you know, there are regulatory alternatives that can, you know, correct that better than market participants who have, you know, a stake in, you know, grabbing the money that's on the table, because that's the case. If you are undervalued because you overvalue your short-term profits, I mean, there's a profit opportunity there. But then even thirdly, even if you believe that, you know, there are persistent market inefficiencies there, it's a bit, I mean, it's the perfect example I always give it as well. You have probably inefficient short-termism, but you also have inefficient long-termism. You have excessive long-termism, like the dot-com bubble or whatever we have in terms of bubbles. So you have issues there as well, and then you have to prove that actually the measure you're using to address the market inefficiency on the one hand doesn't make it worse on the other hand. And I have never seen it proven that the short-termism problem is larger, even if you believe in market inefficiencies, than the occasional long-termism problem that we have as well. Just a comment.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Also-
comment or question?
I also feel that goes back a little bit to the keynote speak, right? Because where we have the partial equilibrium and the general equilibrium. So do we have any proof that this short-termism in Europe is really causing welfare reduction overall, right? To begin with, just to add to that.
A follow-up on that is what I'm hearing from both of it. It's plausible that controlling shareholders is sometimes short-term and sometimes long-term. And it's plausible that the stock market is sometimes short-term and sometimes long, but in different ways. So if we're looking at this from a system-wide perspective and we don't know enough to really do a targeted piece of regulation, it would be plausible to either encourage or be happy if we have a system that has both mechanisms. So when the public market fails, controlling stockholder sees an opportunity and can take it, and vice versa.
I agree with that actually. So yeah, I don't want my first paper to be interpreted as like we need regulation. I don't think we per se do, except maybe to make it possible to allow for dual class share structures, which in Belgium and many other European countries is not possible.
An observation of following up on some comments. It's not, I apologize, but it's a conference. That's why there's two. I've heard the two different notions of long-term and short-termism floating around. One is the one that I used. You do something now that you wouldn't do if you were the full owner, you 100% owner. You know it's bad in your long-term interest as the 100% owner, but you do it to stay in control or whatever. That could be pursuing a project like an internet project. You're a CEO in 1998. You want to have the .com thing in the name, whatever. You might think it's stupid, but you think, hey, if I don't do it, I might be fired and I won't live to see that day. But it's still short-termism, even though you're making a long-term investment. Now, from a policy perspective, there's a separate notion. Are you making long-term investments? Maybe bad ones. So that might be bad long-termism. But if these investments generate positive externalities, and some stuff like electric car manufacturers, if Tesla fails because Elon Musk will still have changed the face of the earth, I think, for the better, because he really pushed the development of electric cars. And so you can do these sorts of things. That two different notions of short-termism, they often merge. And I think some of the public discourse about short-termism becomes understandable if one thinks that in the second understanding, a long-termism has positive externalities that the short-termism doesn't have.
Yes, Tom, I believe in Europe, controlling shareholders are overwhelmingly thinking in the long term, but of course the real question is who's long term? My question to you is the evidence that we have overwhelming that in continental Europe, controlling shareholders are long term in the sense that they want the continuation of their own private benefits? Are you aware of any evidence that I know there are some papers, but in my view, not very convincing on ESG and long-term shareholders. But are you aware of any evidence that controlling shareholders in continental Europe are doing the right thing in the long term for other shareholders than themselves?
No, I don't. I'm not aware. I don't think there's a lot of evidence, and I think this is also a bit what we are trying to do with the research project now to collect more evidence on ownership structures, their impact, and also perhaps survey evidence or interviews how controlling shareholders in Europe think about this. But I don't think there's a lot of evidence.
There's no evidence either way.
No.
Yeah.
You had a comment?
Well, I was going to say something very similar. Indeed, my point was also that it seems to me that there's some like evidence on the question, is there short-termism in Europe or not? Maybe a little bit. What effects do controlling shareholders have? Well, ideally, they even mitigate that short-termism that does exist. So then I would be very wary of drawing any policy conclusions from that, specifically strengthening the position of controlling shareholders. Because even if they would potentially weaken the short-termism, whether it exists or not, indeed, we don't know what else comes from giving controlling shareholders more power. And indeed, there is no clear evidence on looking at the corporate social short-termism, how controlling shareholders exist in that way. So I'd be a bit worried about going further that direction. But I also know that you don't draw that conclusion, you just put it out there as one possible option.
Okay, thank you very much.